What does it say about a room full of powerful people when the only one willing to defend a woman's dignity is the one man everyone else is afraid of? Think about that for a moment. Picture a ballroom. Chandeliers casting gold light across marble floors. Women in gowns that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Men in tailored suits shaking hands and laughing at jokes they've heard 100 times. The clink of crystal glasses. The soft murmur of an orchestra playing something forgettable in the corner. Everything polished. Everything perfect. Everything curated to look like the world is a beautiful, fair, and generous place. Now picture a young woman standing at the edge of all of it. She doesn't quite belong, and she knows it. Not because she isn't worthy. Not because she isn't intelligent or strong or remarkable. But because the world she came from, the scars she carries, and the stories she survived have never been welcomed in rooms like this. She's here anyway. She showed up. And that alone took more courage than half the people in that ballroom will ever need in their lives. Her name is Amara. And tonight, she has no idea that her past is about to walk through the front door. But here is what I need you to understand before we go further. This story is not just about one woman and one night. This is about what happens in every room, in every city, in every circle of power, when someone is being hurt in plain sight, and everyone with the ability to speak chooses silence instead. This is about how abuse doesn't always look like a bruise. Sometimes it looks like a smile. Sometimes it looks like a man in a three-piece suit making a joke at someone else's expense while the crowd laughs nervously, unsure whether to step in or look away. By the time this story is over, you will understand exactly why that silence is dangerous. And you will never look at a crowded room the same way again. So stay with me, because what happened at that charity ball, what one unexpected man chose to do, is something people are still talking about. And it changed everything. If you've ever been in a room where someone needed help and nobody moved, or if you've been that person who needed help and felt completely invisible, this video is for you. Hit that like button right now. Not for the algorithm. For Amara. For everyone who's ever had to be brave in a room that wasn't built for them. Subscribe if you're new, because we tell stories here that the world needs to hear. Let's get into it. Amara had not planned on coming to Seoul. Life, she had learned, rarely goes according to plan. She had grown up in Lagos, the second of 4 children in a family that was not wealthy but was rich in the ways that matter. Love, resilience, the stubborn belief that hard work could carry you somewhere better. Her mother had been a seamstress. Her father, a schoolteacher who quoted proverbs the way other men quoted scripture. Amara had inherited his love of words and her mother's eye for precision, and by the time she was 23, she had channeled both into a career in international development, working for a small NGO focused on education access for girls in sub-Saharan Africa. The work was meaningful. The pay was not spectacular. But she had chosen it deliberately, the way you choose a path that aligns not with your comfort but with your conscience. She had been stationed in Seoul for 8 months when the charity ball invitation arrived. The NGO she worked for had been selected as one of 5 organizations to be recognized at the annual Hanseong Foundation Gala, one of the most prestigious philanthropic events in South Korea. Her supervisor, a warm Korean-American woman named Jean Hee, had handed her the embossed envelope with an apologetic smile. "I know it's not really your scene," Jean Hee had said, "but you've done the most work on the Girls' Literacy Initiative. You should be the one representing us." Amara had stared at the invitation for a long time. She was not afraid of hard work. She was not afraid of boardrooms or difficult conversations or fighting for resources in underfunded meetings. But events like this, events where wealth was the common language and everything was performance, made something in her chest tighten. She had been in rooms like this before. She knew how they could make a person feel simultaneously invisible and over-examined. Too much and not enough all at once. Still, she had said yes. Because the work mattered. Because the girls whose futures her organization was fighting for mattered. And because somewhere, quietly, in the part of herself she had spent years rebuilding, she was tired of letting fear make her decisions. She had bought a dress. Not extravagant. A deep emerald green, elegant in its simplicity. The kind of dress that said, "I know exactly who I am," without shouting it. She had spent an hour doing her hair, let herself feel, just for a moment, that she was allowed to be beautiful. She had taken a taxi to the Hanseong Tower, stood outside the grand entrance for exactly 45 seconds gathering herself, and then walked in. The ballroom was everything she'd expected and more. The ceiling alone could have swallowed her entire apartment building. Long tables were draped in white linen. Enormous floral arrangements, pale orchids and white lilies, rose from every surface like something out of a dream. Waitstaff moved through the crowd like water, offering champagne and small plates of food she couldn't name but knew were expensive. Around her, Korea's elite mingled, tech billionaires, entertainment moguls, politicians, celebrities. People whose names appeared regularly in newspapers and whose faces appeared on the kinds of television programs that assumed you already knew who they were. Amara moved through it all with the careful composure she had trained herself to wear in uncomfortable spaces. She found the table assigned to her NGO, exchanged polite greetings with the other representatives, accepted a glass of sparkling water, and allowed herself a single, quiet exhale. She was here. She was fine. The evening would proceed. The organization would be recognized. She would smile graciously. And then she would go home and take off these heels and eat instant noodles in peace. That was the plan. But that wasn't what happened. Because 20 minutes into the evening, the doors opened again. And the man who walked in changed everything. His name was David Osei. And he was, by every visible measure, a success story. He walked into the ballroom the way certain men walk into every room, like the room had been waiting for him. Tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that had clearly been made for his body specifically. A burgundy pocket square folded with mathematical precision. He was handsome in the way that photographs well. His smile, when he deployed it, and he deployed it often, was wide and warm and engineered to make whoever received it feel special. Amara saw him before he saw her, and in the half-second before her body remembered to be still, something moved through her. Not love, not longing, but something far more primitive. The specific, nerve-deep alarm of a person who has survived a predator recognizing that predator across a room. She turned her face slightly, picked up her glass, breathed. David Osei was not supposed to be here. He was Nigerian, based primarily between Lagos and London, with business interests she had never fully understood and had learned, too late, not to ask about too directly. He had connections in the tech and import-export worlds, legitimate enough on the surface, murky enough beneath it. She had not seen him in 3 years. She had not spoken to him in 2. She had spent the better part of 18 months dismantling the psychological architecture he had spent 4 years building inside her. The voice that told her she was too much and not enough simultaneously, that her value was tied to his approval, that the world beyond him was too dangerous to navigate alone. She had dismantled it. She had rebuilt. She had come to Seoul and she had done good work, and she had learned, cautiously, to trust herself again. And now he was here. She told herself it was a coincidence. Seoul's elite circles, while not small, were not unlimited. International philanthropic events attracted international figures. It was possible, plausible, that his presence had nothing to do with her. She almost believed it. He spotted her 12 minutes later. She knew the exact moment it happened because she felt it, the specific weight of his attention landing on her from across the room. She had spent 4 years learning to read that weight. It had saved her, eventually, when she finally understood what it meant. He smiled, and began to move toward her. She could have left. Later, some people would say she should have. They would say it in that particular tone people use when they want to assign responsibility for someone else's suffering. Gently, rationally, as though the solution to being hunted is simply to run faster. But Amara did not leave. Because this was her event. Her organization's recognition. Her work. And she had promised herself, in the long, quiet process of healing, that she would stop rearranging her life around his convenience. So she stood her ground. Amara. He said her name the way he always had, like a word he owned. I almost didn't recognize you. You look different. Hello, David. Different in a good way, obviously, he added, his smile widening just enough. Though that dress is a little plain for a night like this, don't you think? It was the opening move. She recognized it. A small cut, delivered with a smile, designed to make her flinch and then question whether she'd flinched over nothing. She had spent years not recognizing those cuts for what they were. The dress is fine, she said evenly. He laughed short, social, performed. Of course it is. What are you doing here? I didn't know your organization had connections at this level. And there it was. The second move. The subtle suggestion that she didn't belong, wrapped in the language of curiosity. We were invited, she said. We're being recognized tonight for our work in girls' literacy. Oh, that's wonderful. His tone was that of a man complimenting a child's finger painting. Good for you. It's a small program, but, you know, every contribution counts. She said nothing. Around them, the hum of the party continued. A few people nearby had begun, in that subtle social way, to listen without appearing to listen. And that was when she understood what this evening was actually going to be. Because David Osei had not spotted her by accident. And his smile, she now understood, had nothing to do with warmth. He had come for this. What happened next shocked everyone in that room, but not all at once. It built slowly, the way pressure builds before a storm, the way a crowd shifts from comfortable to uneasy before anyone can name the moment it changed. David had a gift for this. It was, she had come to understand, his primary skill. Not business, not charm, but the orchestration of social humiliation. He was extraordinarily good at making people feel small in spaces where they had no immediate defense. He knew how to use the politics of a room, who was watching, who was listening, what the social cost of intervention was, to create a cage with no visible bars. He began working the people around them. Naturally, easily, the way a man does when he knows exactly what he's doing. He introduced himself to a nearby couple, a Korean entertainment executive and his wife, with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to rooms like this. Within minutes, he had woven Amara into the conversation in a way that served his purpose. Amara and I go way back, he said, placing a hand briefly on her arm in a gesture that looked, from the outside, like warmth. She used to work for one of my associates' organizations in Lagos. Lovely girl. I helped her get some of her early career opportunities, actually. It was a lie constructed from the wreckage of truth. She had never worked for anyone associated with him. He had not helped her career. But the lie was specific enough to sound credible and vague enough to be impossible to immediately refute in polite company. She felt the color rise beneath her skin. That's not accurate, she said, keeping her voice level. He smiled at the couple, an indulgent, what can you do expression crossing his face. She's always been modest. It's a lovely quality. The couple smiled uncomfortably. Neither spoke. And the silence, that complicit, helpless silence, gave David Osei exactly what he wanted. Permission to continue. Over the next 30 minutes, he moved through the room like a slow poison. Everywhere she turned, there he was. Not directly confronting her. That would have been too obvious, too easy to address. Instead, he worked the margins. Comment here. A story there. each one designed to reframe her, to replace her actual self with a version he had manufactured. A version that was dependent, naive, grateful for his attention. A girl from Lagos who had only gotten where she was because of connections she hadn't earned. He told a group of investors that she had been a project of his, that he had mentored her, guided her, helped her navigate spaces she'd found intimidating. He described her, more than once, as sweet. He used the word the way men sometimes do, not as a compliment but as a diminishment disguised as one. And the room, uncertain, unaware of the real history, did what rooms like that tend to do. They deferred to the more confident, more connected, more established presence. They gave him the benefit of the doubt he had not earned. Amara stood in the middle of it, feeling something she had worked very hard, for a very long time, to never feel again. That specific invisibility, that erasure, the sensation of being overwritten by someone else's narrative in a space where you had no power to correct the record. But she was not silent. "I built my career myself," she said clearly, to the group of investors, her voice carrying more steadiness than she felt. "I have never had professional assistance from David or anyone associated with him." The investors looked at each other, then at David, then back at her. David laughed, easy, social. Of course. She's fiercely independent. It's one of the things that made her so endearing back then. Back then." The phrase hung in the air like smoke. She saw it on their faces, the flicker of something, the calculation. Who to believe? The charming, well-connected businessman with the easy smile and the firm handshake? Or the young African woman in the green dress who was clearly, visibly rattled? She knew the answer. She had always known the answer. It was the reason men like David did what they did in rooms like this. Because the math of social power in those spaces was not fair. Had never been fair. And he had spent years learning exactly how to exploit it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 40 minutes into the evening, when David Osei finally stopped being subtle. He had been building toward this. She understood it now in retrospect. The whole thing had been a performance, each act calibrated to soften the crowd, to position himself as the reasonable one, to isolate her. So that when he made his real move, there was no one standing close enough to her to make standing up for her feel natural or easy. He was speaking to a larger group now, perhaps 15 people, an impromptu gathering that had coalesced near the center of the room. A well-known Korean actress, a tech entrepreneur, a member of a prominent family whose name was on 3 buildings in Seoul. David had pulled them into his orbit effortlessly, and Amara had found herself somehow on the edge of the group, unable to extract herself without drawing the kind of attention that would make her look more rattled than she already felt. And then he said it. He was in the middle of a story, something about a charity event he'd attended in London the previous year, when he pivoted smoothly, with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this many times in his mind. "You know," he said, his eyes moving to Amara with what looked, on the surface, like fond reminiscence. "Amara here actually tried to get funding for her organization through me 2 years ago. She sent several emails. I didn't hear from her for months after that." He paused, letting the implication settle, that she had been desperate, had chased him, had been rejected. "I always thought it showed character, the way she kept trying. That kind of persistence is admirable." Another pause, another smile. "Even when it gets a little much." The group went quiet. Amara felt the world narrow to a single crystalline point of fury and pain. Because he had done it. In one carefully constructed sentence, he had done what he had always done. Turned her into a character in his story. A needy woman. A desperate one. Someone who had wanted something from him and had not known when to stop. He had taken her professional outreach, which had happened. She had sent those emails to a general industry contact list, not specifically to him, and he had bent it into something humiliating, into evidence of weakness. into a punchline delivered with a sympathetic face. The group around him shifted. Some looked at her with that particular brand of pity that is almost indistinguishable from condescension. A few laughed softly. Not cruelly, but uncomfortably, the way people laugh when they're not sure what else to do. No one said anything. 15 people. Not one spoke. That was what silence looked like. That was what it cost. Amara opened her mouth. She was going to say something. She didn't know what, but she was not going to stand there and be painted over again. Not again, not in this room, not tonight. She had rebuilt too much of herself for that. But before she could speak, the crowd shifted. He had been there the whole time. That was the thing people kept returning to afterward, in their whispered conversations and their shocked recollections. He had been there the entire evening, and almost no one had spoken directly to him. Not because he was unfamiliar, several people in that room knew exactly who he was, but because of the particular quality of his presence, which was something between authority and warning. His name was Kwon Jae-won. He was 41 years old, impeccably dressed in a black suit with no pocket square, no tie, no ornamentation of any kind. Just clean, severe lines that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He was not the tallest man in the room. He was not the loudest. He had spent the evening in near silence, moving occasionally from one edge of the room to another, speaking rarely, observing constantly. Most people had unconsciously given him a slightly wider berth than they gave others, without being able to say exactly why. Those who knew said nothing. Those who didn't know felt something. Something that lived below the threshold of conscious thought. The way you sense a shift in air pressure before a storm. Kwon Jae-won's official designation, the one on business cards and foundation records and the Hanseong Gala's guest list, was private investor and philanthropist. His actual designation was something the people in this room understood in varying degrees, none of which they would ever say aloud in a place like this. He had been watching David Osei for the better part of an hour. Not because he knew the man. He didn't. But because Kwon Jae-won had spent a significant portion of his adult life reading rooms, and reading people within rooms and understanding dynamics that most people missed, because in his world, missing those dynamics could be catastrophic. And what he had been watching for the past 60 minutes was something he recognized with a clarity that had nothing to do with business. He had seen this before, this specific choreography. The way a man with power and charisma and social momentum could use those tools to take something from someone who had none of those advantages in that particular space. The way a crowd could become complicit without making a single active choice. The way a woman could be surrounded by people and still be utterly alone. He had watched Amara. The way she held herself, straight, controlled, every muscle working harder than it should have needed to. The way she kept her voice measured when everything inside her was clearly not. The way she refused to leave, refused to defer, refused to disappear, and how it was costing her visibly with every minute that passed. He had watched her fight for herself in a room that had decided, without discussing it, to let someone else define her. And when David Osei made his final move, that soft, devastating sentence about emails and persistence and a little much, and the crowd laughed its uncertain laugh, and Amara's face showed the single, split-second fracture she had been keeping contained all evening, Kwon Jae-won set down his glass and walked forward. What would you have done in that room? Be honest with yourself. If you had been standing there, if you had seen what was happening, felt the tension, understood that something was wrong, would you have spoken? Or would you have done what 15 other people did, and waited for someone else to be brave first? There's no shame in the honest answer. Social inertia is one of the most powerful forces in human behavior. We are wired in group settings to follow the crowd, to wait for permission to match the energy of the people around us. And David Osei had read that wiring perfectly, had used it like a tool. But this is what I want you to think about while we watch what happens next. Every person in that room had a choice. and they all made one, even the people who believed they were simply staying neutral. Have you ever been in a moment where you saw something wrong and didn't know whether to step in? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know what went through your mind. Because what happens next shows us exactly what intervention looks like when someone decides the cost of staying silent is too high. Don't go anywhere. The crowd felt him before they saw him move. That was how several people described it afterward. Not that they watched him walk toward the group, but that they became suddenly, acutely aware that the space around David Osei had changed. That the easy confidence David had been wearing all evening had encountered something it did not know how to process. Kwon Jae-won stopped at the edge of the group. He did not push through it. People moved. Unconsciously, automatically, the way people clear a path for something they cannot name. He stood close enough to be part of the conversation. He did not speak immediately. He simply looked at David Osei with an expression that was perfectly, precisely neutral, the kind of neutrality that is not absence of feeling, but complete control of it. David's smile stayed on his face, but something behind his eyes recalculated. "Mr. Kwon," David said, extending a hand, "I don't think we've had the pleasure." Kwon Jae-won did not take the hand. He looked at it for a moment. A brief, deliberate moment, just long enough for the group to notice, and then looked back at David's face. "I've been listening to your conversation," Kwon said. His voice was quiet. It didn't need to be loud. The group had gone very still. "You've been speaking about this woman." He indicated Amara with a slight movement of his head. "For the last 40 minutes. I thought it was interesting." David laughed. The laugh was slightly less easy than his previous ones. "Oh, Amara and I go way back. Old friends." "I wasn't finished," Kwon said. The laugh stopped. The room, not just the group, but the room, had begun to notice. The orchestra continued playing, oblivious, but the social current had shifted. People were turning. Slowly, trying to look casual, not wanting to miss what was happening while also not wanting to be caught watching too closely. "I found it interesting," Kwon continued, his eyes on David, "because I've been in enough rooms to recognize when a person is being managed, and I've been watching you manage this one." He nodded toward Amara again. "For most of this evening, with considerable skill." David's face had moved through several expressions in quick succession, and landed on something that was trying to be amused and was not quite reaching it. "I think you may have misread the situation." "No," Kwon said simply. "I don't think I have." He turned then, and this was the moment people would remember most clearly, this pivot, and looked directly at Amara. His expression changed. Not softened, exactly, but opened. "I don't know your name," he said. "But I watched you spend the last 40 minutes choosing not to disappear. I want you to know that was not invisible." Amara looked at him. Something in her chest, that tightly controlled, carefully maintained compression of everything she was feeling, shifted. She said, "My name is Amara Nwosu. I work for the Hana Girls Education Initiative. We were invited here tonight because of work I led on girls' literacy access in 3 countries. She said it clearly. To the group. To the room. To herself. Kwon nodded once. Then he turned back to David. "The emails she sent," he said, and his voice had changed. Still quiet, but with something beneath it now, something tectonic, were professional outreach to an industry list. Not to you specifically. I know this because I know several people who received the same communication. It was well regarded. It resulted in 2 partnerships with legitimate foundations. He paused. "Not yours." The silence in that circle was now total. David Osei stared at him. "The story you told," Kwon continued, "was not accurate. And the way you told it, the slight emphasis on how, not just what, was a choice. One you made deliberately, in a room full of people. About a woman who has done nothing to you." David found his voice. I'm not sure what you think you're. I'm telling you, Kwon said, what I observed. And I'm telling you in this room with these people. His gaze moved, briefly, across the group that had gathered, which now included perhaps 30 people, some of them among Seoul's most powerful. That it is finished. Whatever you came here to do tonight, it's finished. He did not raise his voice once. He did not threaten. He did not gesture. He did not perform. He simply spoke with the absolute, undecorated certainty of a man who had never needed the validation of an audience to know he was right. And something extraordinary happened. The crowd. The same crowd that had laughed uncertainly at David's joke. The same crowd that had deferred to his easy confidence all evening. The same crowd that had stood silently while a woman was publicly diminished, shifted. Visibly. The way a tide shifts, slow and then undeniable. Eyes moved away from David Osei. No one laughed. No one offered him a sympathetic smile. The entertainment executive who had nodded along to his earlier comments looked suddenly interested in his champagne. The tech entrepreneur looked at Amara with an expression that was trying to recalibrate itself toward something more appropriate. David Osei was still smiling, but the smile had become something else. A thing worn on a face that had run out of other options. "This is a private conversation," he said, and his voice was quieter now. "It stopped being private," Kwon said, "when you made it a performance." What no one in that room knew, what would not become clear until much later in the evening, and only then to a small number of people, was the full extent of what Kwon Jae-won had actually done in those 60 minutes of observation. He had not merely watched. While David worked the room, Kwon had been making quiet inquiries. A word to the Hanseong Foundation's director. A low conversation with a man who knew the investment community well. 2 brief phone calls made from a corner of the corridor outside the ballroom, in a voice too quiet for anyone nearby to hear. He had assembled, in less than an hour, a fairly complete picture of David Osei's business interests, his reputation in Lagos and London, and, most significantly, certain aspects of his financial dealings that several parties would have found very interesting to know about. He had not used this information. Not yet. He had hoped, perhaps, that intervention would be sufficient, that the public correction would be enough. But David Osei, it turned out, had one more move to make. After Kwon turned and spoke briefly to the foundation director, something quiet, something Amara couldn't hear, David Osei approached her. Not with the group watching. In a moment when the circle had dispersed slightly, the crowd redistributing itself with the self-conscious energy of people processing what they'd just witnessed. He moved close enough that only she could hear him. His smile, this close, was gone entirely. "You think he helped you," David said very quietly. "You have no idea what he is." Amara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she had rebuilt. The months of therapy, the journal entries, the slow, painstaking work of learning to trust her own perception again after 4 years of having it dismantled. The morning she had woken up in Seoul, in her small apartment, and realized she had slept through the night without anxiety for the first time in 2 years. She thought about all of it. And then she said very calmly, "Whatever he is," he listened, and then he spoke. "That's more than anyone else in this room did." David stared at her. "Don't contact me again," she said. "Don't speak about me. Don't include me in your stories. We're done, David. We have been for a long time. Tonight just made that true in public." She held his gaze for one more second. Then she walked away from him, and she did not look back. The evening did not end cleanly. Real events rarely do. The charity ball continued. The awards were presented. Amara stood at the podium when the Hannah Girls Education Initiative was recognized, and she spoke about the girls they served, their names, their futures, their right to education that the world had tried to make contingent on conditions girls should never have to meet. She spoke for 4 minutes. When she finished, the applause was real. Not polite. Real. She did not look for David Osei in the crowd. She learned later, from Jean He, that he had left before the awards portion of the evening. She found Kwon Jae-won once more, near the end of the night, by the tall windows overlooking the city. He was standing with a glass of water. She noticed it was water, not champagne. Looking out at the lights, she approached him. He turned slightly. "Thank you," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You were already speaking when I arrived. I just made it harder for people to pretend they couldn't hear." She looked at him for a long moment. The full weight of what that sentence meant. The acknowledgement that her voice had been there all along. That the problem had never been her silence but the room's refusal to receive it. Settled somewhere deep and real inside her. "Why?" she asked. Not combatively. Genuinely. He considered the question with a seriousness that told her he wasn't going to offer a comfortable answer. "Because I've used power carelessly," he said after a moment. "And I've watched other people use it carelessly. And he paused, choosing the word deliberately, tired of knowing what a room is doing and choosing not to name it. She nodded slowly. "People will say things about you," she said. "About tonight. About why you intervened." "Yes," he said simply. "They will. Does that bother you?" He turned back to the window. The city spread out below them, indifferent and luminous. "Less than the alternative," he said. The division came, as he had predicted, in the days that followed. Some people, many people actually, were moved by what had happened. The story spread through Seoul's social circles with the speed and distortion that attends all stories that touch something true. Details shifted in the retelling. Some versions made Kwon more heroic. Some made him more sinister. Some focused on Amara's composure. Some focused on David's humiliation. Some people called it justice. Some called it a power play. Some, and these were perhaps the most uncomfortable voices, pointed out that it had taken the most powerful man in the room to make the room listen, which raised its own questions about whose authority gets recognized and whose gets ignored. They were not wrong to ask those questions. Amara asked them herself. She had wanted to speak. She had been speaking. And it was only when Kwon added his voice, his specific, weighted, socially significant voice, that the room realigned. There was something unresolved in that. Something that the clean narrative of intervention and justice couldn't fully contain. She brought it to her therapist a month later. "He amplified you," her therapist said. "That's different from speaking for you. He named what was happening and used his position to make denial harder. You still had to do the work. You still had to walk away. You still had to speak at that podium." Amara thought about it for a long time. "But why did it take him?" she said finally. Her therapist didn't answer immediately. "Because the room wasn't built for you to be believed alone," she said at last. "That's not about your strength. That's about the room." And that, I think, is the truth this story was always trying to tell us. Not that Amara needed saving. She didn't. She had been fighting for herself all night. But she was fighting alone in a room that had already decided, without saying it out loud, to make fighting harder for her than for him. The question this story leaves us with is not who was the hero. The question is, what kind of room do we want to be in? What kind of person do we want to be when we're in it? Because there were 30 people in that circle, and only one of them moved. Amara Nwosu is still in Seoul. Her organization received 3 new partnerships in the 6 months following the gala, 2 of which came from people who had been in that ballroom. She continues to work on girls' literacy access. She continues, every day, to rebuild and to stand. David Osei did not return to Seoul. Kwon Jae-won attended the next year's Hanseong Gala. He was again largely silent. He stood, again, near the tall windows at the end of the evening, with a glass of water watching the city. No one, this time, needed him to speak. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of someone you know, or a moment you witnessed, or a room you were in where you didn't know what to do, share it. Not for the numbers, because these stories deserve to travel. Because the more people who understand what public humiliation actually looks like, what abuse looks like when it puts on a suit, the harder it becomes for it to operate in silence. Like this video, share it, subscribe if you haven't, and drop in the comments, what would you have done if you'd been in that ballroom? Because I think your answer matters. And I think you already know what it is.